18th and 19th centuries, scholars such as William Jones, Jakob Grimm, and Edward Sievers pioneered the discipline of linguistics. In my own training as a Germanic philologist, I was greatly inspired by how these and other scholars of the era described languages as systems that also change systematically over time. But I was likewise inspired by how these scholars learned languages, sometimes dozens of languages, to encyclopedic levels of knowledge as adult learners. And they did so without the aid of computers or the internet, without apps or even audio recordings. Having good resources obviously helps, but having an understanding of how languages work as systems, as well as a means for actually internalizing those systems, is far more important. So let's look now at how we as adult learners today can master large and complex subjects, such as languages. We can begin by splitting the process into two key components, a knowledge requirement and a skill requirement. The knowledge requirement necessarily precedes the skill requirement. We cannot say a word like apple unless we actually know the word apple. And that's just the way it works. So the knowledge has to come before the skill. And the real challenge for most of us is not in developing the skill, but in coming to grips with the enormous amount of new knowledge we must acquire in order to be able to use a language to any appreciable degree of proficiency. So let's set our sights high and say that we want to develop fluency in a new language, comparable to the level of fluency we hold in our own native tongue. What would the knowledge requirement for this actually look like? This is what it would look like. Along this wall is the total knowledge requirement for developing fluency. By breaking a language apart into its component pieces and mapping each of its subsystems out exhaustively, we can streamline the content down to describe the minimal footprint of knowledge required. This is something I and my team at Linguisticator have been working on over the last several years, so let's break this down. We begin with a map of structure. This is the grammar of the language, and in this particular case, we have Spanish here. Now, we've done this for a number of languages already. We can do it for any language, and to give you a sense of scale, this is a hard copy of our map of Arabic. So on this map is every pattern, variation, and exception in the grammatical system of modern Standard Arabic. This is the most difficult, but also the most important material to learn. These are the patterns we pick up instinctively and organically as children. But the good news is, as adults, we can learn them systematically. And these patterns tell us the relationships between and among things in a language so that we can actually figure out what's going on and start learning from context. Once we have this, picking up vocabulary becomes much faster and easier. And speaking of vocabulary, we can map that out as well. So on this second map to the right of grammar, we have a map of language functions containing all the constructions and vocabulary necessary to reach a professional level. Now we can do this in such a small amount of space because and only because we have the structural map. This way we don't need to learn separately expressions like I would like coffee, you would like coffee, he would like coffee, she would like coffee, and so on. We only need one and any one of those examples to understand the construction, and then as long as we know how the language works as a system from the structural map, we can create any of the variations ourselves. This is one of the coolest things about language. So we end up with these two kind of matrices of knowledge that we can multiply against each other to form the infinite variations of language. To grammar and vocabulary, we must add pronunciation. We need to learn the writing system, and this includes whether a language uses an alphabet or an abjad or logographic script or something else, as well as things like how to write a letter or an email, an essay or a text message. We need to learn body language and a whole host of cultural information, from idiomatic expressions through to the use of register. We also need to develop a cultural sensibility in the language that can really only come about by reading at least a few dozen books, watching dozens of movies and TV programs, listening to lots of music, and participating in cultural activities. A lot of the language we use on a daily basis is actually reference to culturally significant plots and characters and events, and if we don't know those references, no matter how much grammar and vocabulary we have, we are still going to be lost. So this is the total minimal footprint of knowledge required for developing fluency. And it will vary some from person to person and language to language, but this should give you a sense of what's involved. And it is a lot. It's a daunting amount to learn. This is the cold, hard reality of language learning. When you see a resource that says, learn Italian in a couple of weeks or get fluent in a few months, this is not what they're talking about. They are aiming at a much smaller objective. And that's absolutely fine, as long as you understand it within the wider context of what is actually required for developing total fluency. But let's say that instead of running away in fear from all of this, we did actually want to learn it. How would we do it? What is the most efficient and effective means of mastering this knowledge requirement? To answer this question, we need to go back even further in time, to the Middle Ages, when scholars performed feats of memory and intellectual prowess most of us would consider impossible today. The scholasticist Thomas Aquinas dictated multiple books to multiple scribes at the same time, all of which he had composed mentally. Other monks and friars routinely learned the entire Bible by chapter and verse, and many could recite epic or romantic poems of thousands or even tens of thousands of lines in length, and do so both forwards and backwards, and give you any line number at will. Now, these feats seemed impossible to me, or at least impossible for me to perform. But then I read in the appendix to the Book of Memory by Mary Carruthers an exposition written in the 12th century by Hugh of St. Victor on how to use a spatial memory system to actually learn all 150 psalms of the Bible by both psalm number and line number. And that's when I realized that these feats were the result of a trainable skill, which I myself might also develop. So began my long journey in learning to build memory palaces and learning how to apply memory palaces to large and complex systems, such as languages. As people, we have incredibly spatial memories. We're really good at remembering places we've been, and we use space to organize our daily lives. A memory palace is a kind of mental library. It's a way of using imagined space to organize information in the same way we use physical space to organize physical objects. Let's look at how this works. Suppose we want to learn verbs in Spanish. Here we have the present tense singular forms of the verb amar, meaning to love. This is a regular AR conjugation verb. It's one of three main verbal conjugations or patterns in the language. So we have the forms amo, I love, amas, you love, and ama, he or she loves. The important thing here is that we learn the endings. So we have an O, an AS, and an A. Now what we need to do is use our imaginations to come up with associations and convert these textual endings into physical objects or mnemonic images. There are many ways we can do this, but let's just use some animals. So for example, we can use an ostrich to remind us of the O ending. Let's use an ass for the AS and an aardvark for the A. Now these are my associations. They may or may not work for you. You would need to come up with your own. When it comes to using mnemonics, one of the most common mistakes is to think that they're transferable. They're not. Memory as a trainable skill is fundamentally a creative process, so using your own mnemonics will always be more effective. So now that we have our mnemonics for this demonstration, we need to place and organize them in space, and this is where things get tricky, but also really interesting. If they're used at all today, spatial memory techniques are used almost exclusively for learning lists of information. Long strings of numbers, lists of names, facts, dates, decks of cards. The information is in list format. And the problem is when you go to apply these modern memory systems to most practical subjects, including languages, they break down. And the reason they break down is because you cannot reduce complex subjects to just a series of lists. Even though we have a list of endings here, this is not just a list. We need to remember that the ostrich not only represents an O ending, but is also first person, singular, present tense, indicative, active, and part of the AR conjugation. That's 6 additional pieces of information we need to remember just about this one ending. Do we create 6 more mnemonic images? We could, but that's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to get cluttered very quickly. In the Middle Ages, people used spatial memory systems for learning and composing really complex material. And the way they did this was by encoding the complexity into the space itself and the way that space was actually set up. Now we can do this, but it's actually really difficult to do. It's difficult to come up with a complex spatial structure in your imagination and then fill it with imagined mnemonics. And as a skill, it's really difficult to pass on because you have to take all of these imagined structures and transfer them from one person's imagination into somebody else's imagination. It's a difficult thing to do, or at least it's been difficult until now. Because now with virtual reality, we can all step inside the same complex structure the same memory palace. We are now inside a software for memory palaces called McCunk's VR, developed through a collaboration between my company, Linguisticator, and the University of Westminster in London. We're looking at a memory palace for the AR conjugation of verb in Spanish. I know this because there's a giant aardvark here reminding me that this space is for AR verbs. Now, we don't have time to go through this in detail, but you can see that the space is divided into 4 different zones for the 4 different moods in Spanish. And if we go over into the indicative zone, represented by this boy pointing or indicating, you can see we have 4 pairs of pedestals. Each pair is for one of the 4 tenses in Spanish. The pair all the way to the left is for the present tense. The pedestal in the back is for the singular, the one in the front is for the plural. We can now go to the pedestal for the present tense singular and add in the mnemonics we created before, placing the ostrich at the top, the ass bottom right, and the aardvark bottom left. Amo, amas, ama. This is really exciting. Because we've encoded the complexity into the space itself, we know just from where the ostrich is that it's first person, because it's at the top of this triangle. We know it's singular because it's on the singular pedestal. We know it's present, indicative, active, and part of the AR conjugation. We know all of this just from where it is. This removes a tremendous mental burden and means we can learn not only large volumes of material, but also really complex material. And because each mnemonic has a unique location within this system, nothing is locked into a sequence. We can access any piece of information instantly in our memories just by thinking to where it is. This in turn makes it really easy to develop the skill in actually applying and using this grammar. Mnemonics are not transferable, but spatial structures are. The way the space is set up is based on the material itself we're learning, and that doesn't change from person to person. So we could all use this same space to learn the AR conjugation. Each of us would add different mnemonics, and everybody's memory palace would look different, but the underlying structure would be the same. What this means is that in McCunk's VR, we can set up the spaces for really complex subjects and then literally walk users through the process of learning those subjects. In VR, review also becomes really easy. If we want to go over the material, all we have to do is put on a headset and look around. But what's more exciting is that we don't even need to do that much review because the rates of retention on this form of learning are so high. Most of us can remember vividly places we've been in our lives only once, maybe even 10 or 20 years ago. When you take off the headset, you are remembering not just some wisps of your imagination, but something you have seen with your own eyes and experienced spatially. And when you are the one creating the mnemonics, placing them in space, literally building your memory palace, you get to see your own imagination come to life before your eyes. In this way, the material you're learning becomes not only easy to remember, but actually difficult to forget. It would only take us about an hour to add in the rest of the mnemonics to complete this entire conjugation. When we consider this within the wider context of the total knowledge requirement for developing fluency, we can see that while there is still a tremendous amount to learn, there is a process we can follow to master that material that is manageable, creative, and fun, and allows us not only to retain the information, but also access and use it. We are so accustomed to studying something and then forgetting it. When we can be certain that what we put into our memories is still there when we return to it, it completely changes our perception and understanding of learning itself. Rather than watering subjects down to make them more accessible, we can empower people to learn rigorous disciplines by unlocking the strength of our spatial minds. Now today we focused on languages, but this methodology and this software can be used for a range of subjects and applications, from teaching children with dyslexia to medical training, legal training, and even for composing and delivering speeches, such as this one I've given here today. Thank you.